All of us knew about Vijayanagara as a historical period in South Indian history. This is well known, all of us learned about it, but we had much less knowledge about the actual place, the actual city itself. And one of the things that attracted me to the city as a researcher was that here we had a complete urban environment. It wasn't just temples like in other great historical moments. Here at Vijayanagara we had military architecture, we had royal architecture, we had hydraulics, water architecture, we had palaces, and of course we had temples and shrines. So to come here and study this site was to give us an insight, to give us knowledge about, let's say, medieval Hindu imperial cities. In that sense, Hampi Vijayanagara is unique. We have no other city in South India that preserves all these different dimensions. So it was something we very much wished to study and wished to map. And of course what we had to do when we got here was to try to make a list of what we could see, where was it located, and all of that. So that's what we spent much of our time here doing, assisted with students and young professional architects and archaeologists from India and from different countries.
What attracted me to Vijayanagara was George Michell. Before I met George, my interest was in the American Southwest, Native American archaeology. But I met George in the spring of 1980. He showed me maps and drawings of the city that he had made in his first season, which was January 1980. And I got very excited because I saw that some of the things that interested me about historic and prehistoric sites were to be seen on the surface of this landscape. So I asked to come to work with him, and he agreed. And I was able to find a bit of money to help support my first work and subsequent work here. And so we started. George continued documenting the architecture and its context through sketch maps, and I came and started to explore the surface to see what the surface remains were. Because my interest was and is trying to explore the surface remains that are so well preserved here to understand what the layout of the city was, how it was organized, and whether there was an organization that might have meaning to the people who built the city. All kinds of layouts possible in cities that are discussed in the various shastras, building manuals for Indian architecture. So I was interested to see what kinds of design principles were used here, whether they went beyond the shastras. And it was enough to give me 22 years of work.
During the early 1970s, I worked at Badami, which is about 3 hours away by train, I think, and I made a couple of trips to Hampi, just for a day or two. It was all extremely confusing. It was an enormous site. There was almost nowhere to stay. It was extremely hot and glaring, and I couldn't make out what the place was all about. It looked so different to the 7th and 8th century, all this granite landscape and granite architecture. Then I came back a few times during the 1970s. Little by little, I started to get interested in this site, but I didn't think I would ever come and study it. It was just visiting for a couple of days. And then we had the chance to do a volume in a magazine called Marg, which is a Bombay-based magazine, an illustrated magazine. And I proposed to the editor that we do an issue on Hampi Vijayanagara. And this was the excuse that we had to collect a photographer, architecture students, all sorts of people we collected by accident, by design. And in January 1980, do you realize it's almost 40 years ago now? Within a few days, we will have our 40th anniversary. Suddenly there were 8, 9, 10 people. And that's how we started the work. And that's how we got fascinated by drawing, photographing, and trying to understand the different things that we found in Hampi. So it was very fascinating, but I have to tell you, it was a process of developing the idea of research. Then I met John when I came back from that first year, and I said, I think we should go back again because I've just started to do some work. And John came, then we came the next year, and little by little it became a project. We didn't start off planning it as a 20-year project. That wouldn't have been possible. Nor could we have, because there was nowhere to stay. You have to remember that 40 years ago, there was no bottled water. There was no accommodation. We bought some mattresses, put them in the ruins. The tourist canteen made some terrible food for us here at Lotus Mahal. And then the State Archaeology Department here in Karnataka, the director of whom I knew from earlier on, he said, I think we should make a camp. And so we made tents and then thatched huts, and therefore we could come back each year. We had somebody who would cook food, somebody to guard the camp. We could make a project. So you have to understand it was not planned to begin with, but by mid-1980s we were in full swing until 2001-2 we came every year.
First visit, of course, was with George. He very kindly took me through some Deccan Islamic sites at the very end of December, and on January 1st we arrived here. And I only knew what to expect from photographs and a lecture that I had seen that George gave in New York. And it gave some idea, but it didn't give the full impression of what's here. What's here is much grander, much more extraordinary, not only in landscape, but also in the nature of all the monuments, ruins, things scattered across the surface over a vast area. And even then, I never had, at that year and for a few years later, I never really fully realized how big this city was. But George, at that time, was undertaking to expand a sketch map of the city, and it involved walking all over the area that was within a set of fortification walls, an area about 1.5 across, maybe 24 square kilometers, something like that. And so we walked together and we sketched, and I looked, and I learned a lot about how the city looked across the landscape. It was very exciting. After that, the year after that, I decided we should start mapping the city, making surveyed maps of the city. And I was then able to hire a bunch of surveyors from Bangalore who started documenting the city surface through maps. And then with archaeological students, architectural students, we began to actually indicate every cultural feature that we could see was exposed on the surface.
I should like to add that our project did not involve excavation and did not involve conservation. We were a hands-off project because that was our permit to be able to come here. And so we were able freely to walk around the site. We could make drawings, we could make maps, we could make photographs, we could observe. And so ours was what John then called a surface archaeology project. So we looked at what you could see on the ground, what you could see above the ground, and there was plenty to see. There still is plenty to see, whereas our Indian colleagues, they were digging in a very limited area, just a few square meters. They were going down and revealing important things, whereas we went across the site. So we did a completely different sort of treatment, complementary to the state archaeology and central archaeology teams, whom we of course got to know, and we worked together and had meals together. So we all had our different types of research here, and that's what fascinated us all, this interaction, these different ways of looking and studying the site.